Welcome to the Black Korean Heritage title. He mocked and humiliated his mother-in-law at the funeral. What Margaret did next left him in handcuffs. Opening teaser. Rain is pouring down on a black umbrella. A 62-year-old black nurse named Margaret Collins stands at her only daughter's graveside, shoulders trembling with grief so deep it has no name, no bottom, no mercy. The cemetery is gray and cold, the kind of cold that seeps through wool coats and lodge themselves in your bones like a bad memory. Mourners stand in tight clusters, their faces pale and stunned, black umbrellas overlapping like wings. Then, without warning, a man in a tailored black suit snaps his fingers. Two towering security guards step forward from the shadows. They grab Margaret's arms, this 62-year-old woman, this nurse, this mother, and drag her away from her own daughter's graveside in front of God and every witness there. Her shoes drag through the wet grass. Her umbrella tumbles and rolls away into the mud. And Daniel Harper, her son-in-law, watches it all with a slow, satisfied smirk spreading across his face, his voice carrying sharp and clear through the rain. You don't belong here. 2 years before that moment, in a dimly lit law office at midnight, Margaret's brilliant daughter Emily sits across from her attorney, her hands steady despite the fear she is clearly suppressing. She slides a thick, carefully assembled folder across the polished mahogany table. Her voice is barely above a whisper, but every word lands with the weight of iron. If anything happens to me, make sure my mother gets everything. Everything. He can never touch it. Not $1, not one memory. Federal agents in tactical vests storm a glass-walled penthouse office in broad daylight. Computers are seized mid-presentation. Files are boxed and stacked. Shocked employees press themselves against walls. And handcuffs, cold, final, unambiguous click shut around Daniel Harper's wrists as he screams at the top of his lungs into the stunned faces of his investors. This is impossible. This cannot be happening. You know who I am. The evidence that destroyed his entire empire fans across the marble floor like a deck of cards being dealt by justice itself. If you're already hooked and love stories where the arrogant finally get exactly what they deserve, smash that like button right now. Share this with everyone who needs to believe that karma is absolutely, undeniably real, and hit subscribe with notifications on. You will not want to miss a single word of what happens next. Now, let's begin the full story. Chapter 1. The unbreakable bond. Margaret Collins had been a nurse for 38 years, and the hospital had long since become a second skin. She knew every creak of the night shift corridors, every sound the IV machines made when a bag ran dry, every way the fluorescent lights hummed differently at 3 a.m. than they did at noon. Her hands, strong and steady from decades of checking pulses in the dark, adjusting catheters with practiced gentleness, and gripping the hands of frightened patients as they drifted toward the unknown, were hands that people trusted instinctively. Patients on Ward 7 called her Angel Margaret, not as a joke, not as a nickname handed out carelessly, but as a title earned through thousands of small, invisible acts of compassion performed when no one else was watching. She had started in nursing right out of school, young and idealistic, and full of the kind of hope that only exists before life has had the chance to test it fully. Marcus had been waiting for her at the end of that first week, tall, warm-eyed, smelling of sawdust from the furniture shop where he worked, holding a single yellow sunflower and a handwritten note that said simply, "You're going to save a lot of lives, starting with mine." They married young, bought a modest 3-bedroom house on Clover Street with peeling shutters and a front porch that tilted slightly to the left, and filled it immediately with the kind of love that doesn't require decoration. Emily arrived on a Tuesday in October, squalling and furious and absolutely perfect, with Marcus's wide eyes and Margaret's determined set of the jaw. For 7 years, the three of them formed a world complete unto itself. Sundays in the backyard grilling chicken, while the radio played old soul music through the kitchen window. Christmas mornings with too many packages for such a small tree. Marcus teaching Emily to ride her bike on the sidewalk out front while Margaret watched from the porch, covering her mouth with both hands and trying not to laugh every time they both went down in a heap. Then the rain-slicked highway. Then, too, 17 a.m. Then the state trooper's voice on the phone, flat and practiced and terrible. Margaret still remembered with horrible precision the exact texture of the hospital waiting room chair beneath her, the exact quality of the fluorescent light above brutal, unblinking, indifferent the exact temperature of Emily's small hand gripping hers as they sat together under a thin blanket that did nothing against the cold. She had pressed her lips to the top of Emily's head and made the promise that would reorganize the architecture of her entire life. "We're going to be okay, baby. Mama's got you." Always, from that night forward, Margaret did not break. She did not have the luxury. She worked double shifts back to back through the fog of grief, sometimes coming home to find Emily asleep at the kitchen table with her homework half finished and the lamp still burning. She skipped dinners, wore her shoes until the soles wore through, and clipped coupons at midnight before early shifts. But Emily had new school shoes every fall. Emily had notebooks with her name written on the covers in her mother's careful hand. Emily had fresh fruit in the refrigerator and warm clothes for winter, and a mother who showed up to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every single milestone without exception. The kitchen table was their world center of gravity. It was where Margaret helped with algebra problems she had to relearn herself by flashlight after Emily went to sleep, where she braided Emily's hair on Sunday mornings, the beads clicking softly, talking about everything and nothing at once: school drama, neighborhood gossip, what they wanted their lives to look like in 10 years, 20 years. It was where Emily first told her mother she wanted to work in finance, and Margaret had responded without hesitation. "Then you'll be the best one in the room. I'll make sure of it." Emily grew up watching her mother's quiet, unbreakable strength, the way a plant grows toward light instinctively, completely, with every cell. She understood early that strength did not always look like armor or noise. Sometimes it looked like a woman coming home on aching feet at 6 a.m., changing out of her scrubs, and sitting down to help a child with a science project before sleeping 3 hours before her next shift. She internalized that lesson and built herself around it. By 32, Emily Collins was a senior financial analyst at one of the most prestigious investment firms on the East Coast. She commanded a high six-figure salary and sat in boardrooms with men twice her age who had expected, at first, to be able to dismiss her. She made that impossible within 15 minutes, consistently, every single time. She called her mother every night without exception on the drive home from the office, before she went to sleep, sometimes in the parking garage with the engine running just because she needed to hear the familiar voice that had always been her true north. Their Sunday brunches were sacred and non-negotiable. The table would be covered in pancakes and fresh berries, crispy bacon, scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar, and Margaret's legendary cornbread that 3 separate colleagues had once offered to pay money for the recipe. They would sit for hours sometimes, long after the food was finished and cold, talking with the unself-conscious ease of two people who have never needed to perform for each other. Margaret would tease Emily gently about finding a good man. Emily would lean back in her chair and grin and say, "Mama, you set the bar so high the poor man would need a ladder just to reach the first step." Margaret kept those Sunday mornings in her heart like pressed flowers, fragile and perfect and smelling of everything that mattered. She kept them there alongside the photo on the living room wall of 8-year-old Emily standing on a kitchen chair, helping with Sunday dinner, both of them covered in flour, laughing so hard they could barely stand. Margaret would touch the glass of that frame gently sometimes, on her way to bed, and whisper, "We made it, baby. Against everything, we made it." She had no way of knowing, in those warm and ordinary moments, that her brilliant daughter was already quietly, carefully, methodically building a fortress around her. That every lesson Margaret had ever taught: be kind but never weak, observe everything, protect what matters with everything you have, was being transformed by Emily into something powerful enough to outlast her own life. The bond between them was not sentimental decoration. It was structural, load-bearing, the kind of love that doesn't dissolve under pressure, it concentrates, and it was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have fully imagined. Chapter 2. The shadow enters Daniel Harper arrived in their lives the way dangerous things often do, polished, charming, and immediately impressive on every surface that could be easily examined. Emily met him at a charity gala for a Children's Hospital Foundation black tie, rooftop terrace, the kind of event where the glasses were crystal and the conversations were calculated. Daniel was the kind of man who commanded rooms without appearing to try. Tall, immaculately dressed in a suit that had clearly been made for his specific measurements, with a jaw that looked sculpted and eyes that were attentive in a way that felt, at first, like genuine interest. He was the founder and CEO of Harper Capital, a venture capital firm that had backed several high-profile tech companies and cultivated an aura of golden touch success. Emily, being Emily, was not swept away immediately. She was guarded, precise, perceptive in ways that had made her exceptional at her work and careful in her personal life. But Daniel was patient, and he was extremely good at what he did. He called when he said he would. He remembered what she said in passing. He showed up to their early dates having clearly thought about them in advance. For a woman whose career had taught her to identify false presentations with speed and accuracy, he was, for a short time, convincingly real. Margaret knew from the first dinner. Not because of anything she could point to cleanly, no single smoking incident, no obvious cruelty, no obvious lie. It was something subtler and more fundamental. It was the way Daniel's eyes moved when he thought no one was watching. The way they swept her modest living room, the faded floral wallpaper, the good dishes she'd brought out specially, the cornbread and collard greens and fried chicken she'd spent the afternoon making, and registered it all as an assessment rather than a welcome. He ate sparingly and didn't comment on the food, which a gracious man always would. He talked about himself for most of the evening. Not boastfully in an obvious way, he was too skilled for that, but constantly redirecting conversation back toward his accomplishments, his connections, his vision. He name-dropped senators and tech billionaires the way other people named neighbors. He talked about his private jet not as a statement but as a matter of fact, which was somehow more revealing than bragging outright would have been. Margaret smiled the entire evening. She was 60 years old and had spent 4 decades reading people in hospital beds and emergency rooms and dark corridors at 4 a.m., reading the difference between someone who was going to be okay and someone who wasn't, between someone in pain and someone performing pain. She knew exactly what Daniel Harper was. She just had no idea yet of the full extent. After he left, taillights of the black car disappearing down Clover Street, she found Emily in the kitchen washing dishes and said quietly, "Baby, that man looks at people the way he looks at properties. Like everything is something to be acquired or disposed of." Emily's hands paused briefly in the soapy water. Then she turned and smiled in the way she did when she was more uncertain than she wanted to show. "Mama, he's ambitious. That's not a crime. He treats me well. Give him a chance." Margaret gave him the chance because Emily asked. But she started the notebook that same week, a small leather-bound journal she kept in her nightstand drawer. She wrote down dates and observations the way she charted patient vitals methodically, factually, without emotional embellishment. A record of what her instincts were telling her, in case she ever needed to point to something concrete. The first year of dadding looked, on the outside, like a romance. Lavish weekends away. Dinners at restaurants with prefix menus and no prices on the women's copies. Jewelry that arrived in matte black boxes. Emily appeared in photographs on Daniel's Instagram in designer gowns, glowing, successful, at ease beside a man who looked, to the world, like everything she deserved. But Margaret heard it first in her daughter's voice on the phone. The laugh that had always been full-bodied and unguarded began to flatten. The stories Emily told shifted in tone, less "let me tell you what happened today" and more "let me explain why things are more complicated than they seem." She started canceling Sunday brunches. Once, then twice, then with increasing regularity, each time with an excuse that had the slightly practiced sound of something prepared in advance. "He's under pressure with the board, Mama. He doesn't mean it the way it sounds. It'll settle down once the new fund closes." The wedding came faster than Margaret was comfortable with. at a waterfront venue that cost more than her entire house was worth. Emily was luminous in a gown that seemed made of moonlight, and Margaret wept with the complex tears of a mother who loves her child absolutely and fears for her at the same time. She gave her toast with steady hands and looked directly at Daniel as she delivered the words with the gentleness of a warning, "Take care of my baby. She is everything." Daniel smiled the smile of a man being watched and knowing exactly what expression to wear. In the year that followed, the cracks became fractures. Emily stopped initiating Sunday brunch entirely. She lost weight that she couldn't afford to lose. Phone calls came later and later, and sometimes not at all. When Margaret drove to the beautiful high-rise apartment unannounced one evening, and Emily met her at the door looking startled, wearing a long-sleeved blouse on a warm day, Margaret felt the cold she had first felt at that dinner table settle permanently somewhere behind her sternum. She did not push. She had learned enough about control and isolation to know that pushing too hard could sever the line entirely. Instead, she said, "I made too much cornbread. I thought you might want some." And Emily pulled her into a hug that lasted too long to be casual. Margaret's notebook grew thicker. And somewhere across the city, in a law office that Emily visited during her lunch breaks, in encrypted emails sent from a private account Daniel didn't know about, in quiet conversations with a private investigator whose card she kept folded in the inner lining of her work bag, Emily Collins was doing the same thing, only on a scale, and with a precision that her mother wouldn't learn about until it was far too late for Daniel Harper to stop any of it. Chapter 3. The Heartbreak and the Ultimate Humiliation. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in March. Emily had collapsed at her desk at the office. An ambulance had been called. She was already at St. Catherine's Hospital by the time Daniel called Margaret, and something in the way he delivered the information, measured, efficient, with the slight impatience of a man relaying a logistical inconvenience, sent Margaret out the door still wearing her coat half on, moving at a pace that her colleagues at the hospital would have recognized as the walk she used when she was suppressing panic. The official story that Daniel offered to anyone who asked was exhaustion, the brutal demands of Emily's career, the pressure of a high-stakes industry, the body simply giving out under relentless professional stress. He delivered this narrative with the polished fluency of someone who had prepared it in advance, and it sounded reasonable enough to people who didn't know Emily the way Margaret did. Margaret walked into that hospital room and knew immediately that it was not exhaustion. She had seen exhaustion in 38 years of nursing. She had seen what it did to the body, the gray pallor, the hollowed eyes, the weight loss, the tremor. But she had also seen what slow systemic damage looked like, and the picture her daughter presented in that hospital bed, her skin the wrong color, her eyes glassy in a way that went beyond fatigue, her hands trembling even in sleep, triggered every clinical instinct Margaret had developed over 4 decades. She said nothing directly. She simply stayed. She dropped her own shifts, called in every favor owed her at the hospital, and moved herself into the room the way she had once moved into Emily's childhood bedroom when she had a fever at age 9, with the total, uncomplicated commitment of a mother who has decided that nothing else exists. She held Emily's hand during the day and slept in the chair beside her at night, waking for every change in Emily's breathing, every shift in her vital signs, cataloging everything in the nurse's part of her brain, while the mother part simply refused to accept what the nurse's part was telling her. Emily had her good hours and her bad hours. In the good hours, she was still herself, sharp, funny, clear-eyed, reaching for her mother's hand and squeezing it with a grip that still had warmth in it. She asked about patients on Margaret's ward by name. She made Margaret laugh twice on a Tuesday afternoon with a story about her most pompous colleague. But in the bad hours she would drift into a half-consciousness that was frightening to witness, her voice thin, her words slightly detached from time. Daniel visited infrequently. When he came, he stood at the foot of the bed rather than beside it, checked his phone more than he checked his wife, and spoke to the doctors with the tone of a man managing a project timeline. Margaret watched all of it from her chair without saying a word, adding everything to the inventory of things she knew and could not yet prove. In one of her final fully lucid windows, Emily turned her head and found her mother's eyes with a focus and clarity that cut through all the medication and all the illness, and landed like a signal from deep underwater. She wrapped both hands around Margaret's hand and squeezed with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her physical body. Her voice was barely a whisper, but every syllable was deliberate. "Mama, no matter what happens, I've taken care of everything. You'll understand, trust me. Promise me you'll keep fighting." Margaret had thought it was the pain medications, the way they sometimes clarified things in ways that later turned out to be disorganized thinking dressed up as epiphany. She pressed her lips to Emily's forehead and said, "Hush now. Rest. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." 12 days later at 3:17 in the morning, as rain hit the hospital windows with the particular violence of a storm that seemed almost personal in its timing, Emily Collins took her last breath with her mother's hand wrapped around hers, and Margaret's world ended for the second time in her life. The funeral was on a Friday. The rain did not let up. Margaret stood at the graveside in the black dress she had bought at the only formal shop she knew on Clover Street, holding her umbrella with hands that had not stopped shaking in 4 days. She had slept perhaps 6 hours since Emily's death, not in one stretch, but in fragments, each time woken by the disorienting horror of remembering. She had made no fewer than 5 separate attempts to eat, and succeeded at approximately none of them. She was running on grief, and the 40 years of professional discipline that made it possible to stand upright when every cellular instinct was demanding the ground. Around her, guests assembled in expensive black clothing: Daniel's colleagues, investors, people who had known Emily professionally, a scattering of people who had known them both personally. The flower arrangements were enormous and elaborate, clearly chosen by someone for impact rather than sentiment. A string quartet played something restrained and generic under a white canopy tent. Daniel stood at the podium delivering his eulogy, and Margaret listened to him describe her daughter with the flat, curated vocabulary of a man who had never once understood the person he was married to. He called Emily a brilliant professional and dedicated partner, and an exceptional mind who contributed significantly to our shared vision language that felt like a quarterly report rather than a remembrance of a human being who had laughed until she cried over cornbread and sung off-key to old Motown songs in her mother's kitchen. Margaret's jaw was tight. Her grip on the umbrella handle had gone white at the knuckles. She was doing the thing she had done at hospital bedsides for 4 decades, staying present, holding it together, keeping her face composed even while the inside was something else entirely. Then Daniel paused. He looked directly at her. The pause stretched a beat too long, and then in a voice he did not lower, in a voice he chose, quite deliberately, to project, he said, "Margaret, I think it's best if you step back. This service is for family." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Margaret felt the words arrive in a sequence: heard first, then processed, then understood, and in the understanding, something shifted in her that was irreversible. Before she could respond, before a single syllable could form, the 2 security guards materialized at her sides with the efficiency of something choreographed. They took her by the arms and they walked her, not escorted, walked, moved, removed away from her own daughter's graveside, through the mud, through the rain, past the stunned faces of every witness, past the phone cameras that several people had raised instinctively, past the white canopy and the enormous flowers and the string quartet that had gone silent. Her umbrella fell. She didn't have a free hand to retrieve it. The rain soaked through her coat, through her dress, through everything, and she could hear Daniel's voice behind her resuming the eulogy as if an interruption of only minor significance had just been handled. She did not cry. Not then. The grief was too large for crying in that moment. She stood in the rain outside the cemetery gates alone, drenched, 62 years old, and felt something crystallize inside her that was harder and cleaner and more purposeful than grief. Later, the video leaked. A guest had captured everything on their phone and posted it without fanfare to a small social media account, and by the next morning it had been shared several 100,000 times and was trending nationally under variations of the word disgraceful. Margaret saw the clip for the first time sitting at Emily's childhood kitchen table in her own home. On a phone her neighbor had brought over with a casserole, and a look of barely contained outrage. She watched herself being dragged through the mud in the rain. She watched Daniel Harper smirk with the detached clarity of a woman looking at evidence rather than a wound. She set the phone down on the table, and she sat for a long moment in the absolute silence of a house that had always had two people in it and now had one. Then she said, to no one, in the voice she used for the hardest and most necessary things, "Okay." Chapter 4. The hidden masterpiece. The knock at the door came on a Tuesday, 14 days after the funeral. Margaret had spent those 2 weeks in the suspended animation of acute grief, moving through the house on automatic, eating when reminded, sleeping in fragments, receiving neighbors with the grace of a woman raised to be gracious even when she was bleeding. She had received flowers, food, cards, phone calls, and approximately 200 messages from strangers who had seen the video and wanted her to know that what had been done to her was seen and was wrong. She had responded to almost none of them, not from coldness but from the simple impossibility of having enough self left over. When she opened the door and saw Michael Lawson, a serious, quiet man in his late 40s, gray suit, leather briefcase, eyes that carried the specific weight of someone who is about to change the conditions of another person's life, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in 2 weeks. Not recognition exactly. More like the particular alertness of a nurse whose patient's vital signs have just shifted in a significant direction. She invited him in. He sat on the edge of the worn floral couch with the careful posture of a man in someone else's grief, and he said, "Mrs. Collins, Emily came to see me 2 years ago. She knew what she was dealing with. She was precise, she was thorough, and she was determined. What she built to protect you, I've been practicing estate law for 22 years. I have never seen anything like it." He opened the briefcase. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret sat across from Michael Lawson at the same kitchen table where she had helped Emily with algebra homework and braided her hair and made Sunday brunch for 30 years. And she watched her daughter's love for her materialize into documented, legal, financial, and forensic reality. The revocable trust was first. Emily had spent 8 months working with two of the best estate attorneys in the state to construct an instrument of such deliberate thoroughness that Daniel's legal team, and they had already attempted, Michael confirmed, to contest it on 3 separate grounds, had found no viable angle of attack. Everything was properly executed, witnessed, notarized, filed in multiple jurisdictions, and held in a structure that insulated it from spousal claim, from litigation, and from the kind of expensive delay tactics that wealthy men use to exhaust their opponents. The trust named Margaret Collins as sole beneficiary of $40 million in assets, money market accounts, investment portfolios, life insurance policies, and real estate holdings that Emily had quietly moved and restructured over 24 months while appearing to Daniel to be entirely absorbed in her work. $40 million. Margaret's hands were folded on the table, and they did not move when she heard the number. Then came the evidence files. Emily had been meticulous in the way that only someone who understands both the necessity and the stakes can be. She had recorded conversations with Daniel using devices so small and so well placed that 2 security sweeps of their apartment had failed to locate them. The recordings covered 22 months. They included Daniel's late-night phone calls with associates who were clearly not conducting legitimate business, conversations in which he casually discussed falsified investor documents with the comfort of a man who believes absolutely that he will never be caught. They included arguments with Emily, his voice, a controlled escalation from condescension to threat to something colder and more explicit, in which he made statements whose legal significance Emily had clearly recognized in real time. They included, on a recording dated 11 months before Emily's hospitalization, a phone conversation in which Daniel discussed with an unknown party a long-term solution to the liability in terms that, combined with the forensic evidence Emily had separately assembled, amounted to a documented conspiracy. Emily had also been keeping her own medical records. She had sought care from a physician entirely outside the network, associated with Daniel A. Doctor she had found through her private investigator, in a different part of the city, under a variation of her maiden name. Over 9 months, she had documented a pattern of symptoms and provided biological samples that were now held in sealed forensic storage, analyzed by a toxicologist whose findings had already been shared with the appropriate federal authorities the previous week. The toxicology findings were in the folder. Margaret read them with the focused, steady eyes of a nurse. She read them twice. Then she set them down carefully on the table and was quiet for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. "Tell me what comes next," she said. "Tell me exactly what I need to do." Michael Lawson opened the next section of the folder. The plan Emily had outlined, and yes, there was an outline, written in Emily's precise handwriting on pale blue legal paper, had 4 stages. The trust activation was already complete. The evidence transfer to federal authorities was ready and required only Margaret's authorization as trust beneficiary to execute. The forensic accountants Emily had identified were on standby, waiting for a call, and the investigative team that had been quietly building the parallel case for 13 months had enough to move the moment the formal complaint was filed. Emily had thought of everything. She had thought of everything the way a woman thinks who loves someone more than she fears the consequences. At the back of the folder, in a pale blue envelope sealed with a small sticker, a yellow sunflower. The same flower Marcus had once given Margaret at the end of a long first week, was a letter. Michael stepped out of the room to take a phone call, giving her privacy she hadn't asked for but needed. Margaret opened the envelope and read her daughter's handwriting. "Mama, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I'm so sorry for what that means. I need you to know that not one day went by that I didn't know what you sacrificed for me, and not one day went by that I wasn't trying to make sure that sacrifice was protected. You are the reason I knew what real strength looked like. You are the reason I knew the difference between love and control. Use what I've left you to rest, and then when you're ready, use it to protect others the way you protected me. I love you more than there are words for. I love you more than I ever said, though I tried. Be strong, Mama. Finish what I started. Your Emily." Margaret held the letter against her chest with both hands and breathed. The house was completely silent except for the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn mower on the street and the familiar creak of the 3rd stair that had needed fixing for 15 years. When Michael came back into the kitchen, Margaret was standing at the counter. Her posture had changed. The grief was still there, it would always be there. She knew that, but something had organized itself around it. Something purposeful and unbreakable. "Let's finish what my baby started," she said. Chapter 5. The strike. Margaret walked into the federal building the following morning at 8:47 a.m. She wore the black dress from the funeral, freshly pressed, her best earrings, and the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who has nothing left to fear because the thing she feared most has already happened and she is still standing. She carried the evidence folder in both hands. She had read every page. She understood every page. She walked to the reception desk and asked for the federal prosecutor by name. Emily had included the name in her outline, and when the receptionist asked the nature of her visit, she said clearly and without drama, "I have evidence of federal financial crimes and first-degree unlawful killing. I believe the information is time-sensitive." She was not kept waiting long. The prosecutor was a woman in her late 50s named Sandra Reeves, with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who has heard a great many things in her career and learned to distinguish signal from noise with precision. She sat across from Margaret in a conference room with a view of the city and opened the folder. She was quiet for a long time as she read. Her assistant was quiet too. At a certain point, Sandra Reeves stopped reading, looked up at Margaret and said with measured care, "Mrs. Collins, how long did your daughter spend building this?" 2 years, Margaret said. Sandra Reeves looked back at the folder. "She was extraordinary," she said quietly, to the papers rather than to Margaret, and returned to reading. The warrants were issued by 10:15 a.m. at 11:47 a.m. Daniel Harper was in the 40th floor conference room of Harper Capital's penthouse offices, in front of 12 investors and 6 members of his board, midway through a presentation about a new fund that was projecting 40% returns in its first year. He was at his most impressive, controlled, fluent, radiating the particular confidence of a man who has never genuinely believed consequences apply to him. The elevator doors opened. The first agent through was followed by 7 more. Blue windbreakers, tactical vests, the methodical, organized speed of people executing a warrant they have spent considerable time preparing. 2 agents went immediately to the server room with technical specialists. 3 positioned themselves at the room's exits. The lead agent walked directly to the head of the table, identified herself to the room, and addressed Daniel Harper by his full name in a voice that was professionally calm and absolutely unyielding. Daniel's first instinct, and it was visibly his instinct, a fraction of a second before the constructed composure could reassert itself, was the small flinch of a man who has always known, somewhere below the arrogance, that this was possible. Then the composure came back. The voice rose. The name-dropping started immediately, a rapid inventory of connections and contacts and relationships with people in positions of oversight who would, he was apparently certain, resolve this misunderstanding within the hour. The agent let him finish. Then she informed him of the charges: wire fraud, money laundering, falsification of investment documents, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. And then, in a tone that did not change register even slightly, first-degree unlawful killing. The room went absolutely still. The handcuffs were on before the echo of that last phrase had fully dissipated. Daniel Harper, in the clothes he had dressed in that morning as the untouchable architect of a 40-floor empire, was walked through his own office past the employees who had feared him and the associates who had enabled him, through the lobby, past the security desk, and out through the glass front doors of the building he owned into the open air, where 2 black SUVs and 3 news cameras that someone had clearly tipped off were waiting. He was still talking. He talked all the way to the vehicle. He remained, to the end of that walk, genuinely convinced that the machinery of his connections would intervene at any moment, that someone would appear and make a call, and have this reversed before it became a public story. He had spent his entire adult life inside a system that had always, eventually, accommodated him. He could not yet fully process that the system had changed because of a woman who was dead and a mother who had spent the night reading legal documents at a kitchen table on Clover Street. The news hit national outlets within 40 minutes. The Harper Capital website crashed under traffic within the hour. 3 board members retained independent counsel before noon. 2 investors who had grown quietly concerned over the past year and had, on Emily's careful advice communicated through channels Daniel didn't know about, preserved their own records, found that those records were now exactly what federal investigators wanted. Margaret watched the coverage on the small television in her living room, in the chair that had always been her chair, with a cup of tea she had made and mostly forgotten growing cold on the side table. She watched Daniel Harper being placed in the back of a government vehicle. She watched the building she had never been permitted to visit being walked through by federal agents. She watched the crawl at the bottom of the screen as the charges were listed, and the reporters began their first rough sketches of a story they didn't yet understand the full dimensions of. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something older and quieter than triumph, the feeling of a debt honored, a promise kept, a final act of love completed by proxy. She set down the cold tea, picked up the phone, and called Michael Lawson. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She sat for a moment more in the quiet of the house. Then she got up, walked to the wall of photographs, and stood in front of the picture of 8-year-old Emily on the kitchen chair, flour on both their faces, both of them laughing with the full-body abandon of people who don't yet know what's coming. She pressed her fingertips to the glass. "I finished it, baby," she whispered. "I finished what you started." Chapter 6. Justice served. A legacy born. The trial ran for 11 days and produced coverage of the kind that becomes a cultural reference point, the sort of story that people are still explaining to each other at dinner tables years later. The kind that makes its way into law school case studies and documentary proposals and occasional late-night conversations about whether justice is real or just a story we tell ourselves to get through the harder truths. The prosecution was methodical and devastating. Emily's recordings were played in open court. Daniel's voice, in his own words, across dozens of conversations, building an edifice of documented guilt so comprehensive that his defense team's core strategy shifted midway through the second week from contesting the evidence to attempting to contextualize it. This did not go well for them. Emily had been extraordinarily careful about chain of custody. Every recording was properly authenticated. Every document had been prepared in a way that anticipated the arguments that would later be made against it. The toxicology evidence was the moment the courtroom went fully silent. The toxicologist Emily had engaged a researcher with a national reputation and testimony in 37 prior federal cases, explained with clinical precision the specific compound found in Emily's preserved biological samples, its pharmacological properties, the timeline of exposure that the evidence supported, and the matching substances found in the private safe at Daniel's home during the initial search. He spoke for 90 minutes without notes. The jury took notes throughout. Daniel's attorney objected 11 times during this testimony. 6 of the objections were sustained, 5 were overruled, and not one of them changed the fundamental nature of what the jury had heard. Margaret testified on the 4th day, dressed in a gray suit she had bought for Emily's college graduation 15 years earlier. She answered every question in the same steady, precise voice she used with doctors when reporting patient conditions at shift handover: organized, direct, unembellished. She did not cry on the stand, though several jurors did. She did not perform her grief or her righteousness. She simply told the truth, which turned out to be more than sufficient. When the defense attempted to suggest in cross-examination that Margaret had a personal motive to misrepresent her relationship with Daniel, she waited a full beat before answering and then said, quietly, "The evidence is what it is. My feelings about my son-in-law have no bearing on recorded conversations, toxicology reports, or offshore bank accounts." Several jurors were observed writing in their notebooks at that moment. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned guilty on all counts. Judge Patricia Monroe, who had presided over federal criminal cases for 19 years and had not, by all public accounts, been surprised by very much in at least a decade, delivered the sentence in a voice that was measured and entirely deliberate. 45 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole, full financial restitution to the defrauded investors, and forfeiture of all Harper Capital assets to the receivership. Before she read the sentence, she did something that people who were in the courtroom that day would remember and retell. She looked directly at Margaret Collins and said, in an aside that was technically outside the formal proceeding, "Mrs. Collins, your daughter's foresight and courage were remarkable. This court thanks her." When the gavel came down, Margaret was sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Daniel Harper for the last time. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely small, not powerful, not polished, not in command of any room. Just a man about to be taken to a place he had never once imagined himself going. The marshals led him out. Margaret exhaled slowly, completely. Beside her, Michael Lawson put a gentle hand on her shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The Emily Collins Foundation opened its doors 14 months later in a renovated building on the east side of the city, 4 stories, freshly painted in warm colors that Emily had always liked, with wide windows that let in substantial light, and a front entrance designed by an architect whose brief had been, in Margaret's words, "I want women walking through that door to feel like they are walking towards something, not away from it." The foundation provides emergency housing with case management, legal aid through a staff of 5 attorneys who handle family law, restraining orders, and custody matters, vocational training programs in fields with strong employment outcomes, mental health counseling with a staff of 6 therapists who specialize in trauma, and the Emily Collins Nursing Scholarship, awarded annually to women returning to education from difficult circumstances. In its first year, the foundation served 312 women and their children. 87 women completed the vocational training program and obtained employment. 14 restraining orders were successfully obtained through the legal team. 2 nursing scholarship recipients enrolled in accredited nursing programs. The board of directors included 3 former clients' women who had used the foundation's resources and then turned around and brought their skills back into the organization that had helped them. Margaret served as executive director. She was, by any measure, extraordinary at it. She brought to the role the same qualities that had made her legendary on Ward 7, the ability to be simultaneously kind and exact, the instinct for what people actually needed as distinct from what they said they needed, the particular authority of someone who has been through the worst and is not afraid of it. Staff members said privately that they had never worked for anyone who made them feel more capable. Clients said that Margaret Collins had a way of making you believe that your survival was not an accident but a foundation. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, on a clear morning in October, Margaret stood at the podium in front of a crowd that included survivors, donors, city officials, the prosecutor Sandra Reeves, Michael Lawson, and 3 journalists whose stories would run that afternoon. She looked out at the crowd for a moment before speaking, taking in the faces, many of them marked by things they had been through that Margaret understood in her bones were not unlike what she had been through herself. She had prepared remarks. She used approximately 1/3 of them. The rest she gave without notes, in the voice of a woman who had been distilled by grief and purpose into something essential. "My daughter didn't leave me money," she said. "She left me a mission." She spent 2 years of her life, in the middle of everything she was carrying, making sure that I would be protected and that the protection she built could be passed forward. She understood that what had been done to her was part of something larger, a pattern that gets repeated because women in dangerous situations are often isolated, under-resourced, and alone at exactly the moment they most need support. I spent 38 years in nursing. I took care of thousands of people in their worst hours, but I couldn't protect the one person I loved most when she needed it. What I can do now, what this foundation will do every day with every resource Emily left, is make sure that other mothers and other daughters have somewhere to go, have people in their corner, have the legal and financial and emotional support that changes survival from a hope into an outcome. To every woman listening, you are not alone. You are not the problem. You are not too much or too little or too late. You are enough. You are always enough. And this building will be here every day to make sure you know it. The standing ovation lasted a long time. Margaret stood at the podium and let it wash over her, not with the uncomfortable deflection of someone unaccustomed to being honored, but with the steady, open gratitude of a woman who understood that the applause was not really for her. It was for Emily. It was for the years of Sunday brunch and braided hair and lullabies sung until her voice gave out and double shifts worked in the dark, and a promise made in a hospital corridor at 2:17 a.m. that had turned out, impossibly and completely, to have been kept. Somewhere, Margaret was certain, her daughter was smiling. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a mother who has nothing left to lose and everything left to give. Never underestimate the love of a daughter who sees clearly, plans carefully, and makes sure that what she loves most will endure. And never, ever mistake silence for surrender. If this story moved you, if you felt something real in these chapters, drop the word justice in the comments right now and tell us what you would have done in Margaret's shoes. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe that the truth has weight and love has reach, and subscribe with notifications on. Every story we tell here is about the people who faced the worst and chose to keep going. We'll see you in the next one. Outro music. Slow build, warm strings, rising to something quietly triumphant. End next.